Hey everyone, Frank here for Geekery Collective, and welcome back to part 3 of our mini-series on the Zelda timeline. For this third segment, I'll be talking about Breath of the Wild and where I think it might be in the timeline, so the obligatory spoiler alert is in effect. Now, enough information really hasn't been revealed about the game for us to make a decisive, accurate placement for it. There's speculation all over the place that it could be on any of the 3 timelines, or even after Skyward Sword. The idea that it takes place after Twilight Princess is the only one I'm really having trouble considering. For sake of time, and because I hate the official timeline's shenanigans, I'm just going to stick to the revised timeline I've proposed. So, based on the information presented to us thus far, I believe Breath of the Wild takes place near the end of the Wind Waker timeline after Spirit Tracks. I know what you're thinking, geez Frank, just put everything on the Wind Waker timeline. But if the shoe fits, so what do we know so far that would make it seem like it's on the Wind Waker timeline?
Once again, we're looking at a Hyrule that is desolate of any civilization, asterisk. At least nothing as high-functioning as Castle Town. We see ruins of structures clearly referencing landmarks from Ocarina, for instance, the Temple of Time.
YouTuber Zeltik actually made a video bringing up Breath of the Wild's overworld map. If you haven't seen it yet, you should check it out. There's a link to it in the description below.
Basically, the overworld shows what appears to be remnants of City Market, Hyrule Castle, the path leading to the castle, and the walls, all from Ocarina. Pretty convincing stuff if you ask me. Now I will say, I don't actually believe Calamity Ganon is the cause of that destruction. That's all from the Flood, but I'll explain his whole thing later. So this is definitely post-Ocarina, but on which branch after Ocarina? What happened to everything? Well, where do we know for certain that things already went really south for Hyrule after Ocarina? Wind Waker is the candidate to come to mind the most. I mean, we just finished covering how old Hyrule was washed away by the former king of Hyrule in the last segment. Now, my only sources of evidence that lead me to believe Breath of the Wild takes place after Wind Waker is pretty much the same as many other people's. There's a collectible item in Breath of the Wild called Rock Salt with a description of crystallized salt from the Ancient Sea. What Ancient Sea could that be? The Great Sea from Wind Waker, which apparently dried up. The next piece of evidence is the inclusion of the Koroks. Now, what are the Koroks? Where on earth did they come from? Well, we learned from the Great Deku Tree in Wind Waker that once upon a time, long ago, the Koroks took on human forms, but when they came to live on the sea, they took these shapes. But now that the Ancient Sea has dried up, the Koroks continue to exist in the world and remained in those forms. Even the individual, physical appearances of each Korok in Breath of the Wild are identical to the Koroks in Wind Waker. Almost as if these are the same exact Korok we met in Wind Waker, but have survived long enough for us to encounter them again after the sea had dried up. Some will argue the Koroks did exist in other timelines, as there was a painting of one in Link Between Worlds, and again in the Miiverse gallery in Triforce Heroes. That I honestly consider as just an Easter egg. Just as there's a picture of Mario in A Link to the Past. It has no real impact on the game itself as a picture versus interacting with an actual Korok. And some of you will say the Ancient Sea is just the Lanayru Sea from Skyward Sword. But consider this, in Wind Waker, Hyrule lost all of its history. They don't know about the Lanayru Sea anymore. That history was lost. The only Ancient Sea, ancient relative to them, is the Great Sea that dried up.
This part's just conjecture from me theorizing for too long probably, but more and more, I'm starting to convince myself that Calamity Ganon is a product of Wind Waker. Look back at Skyward Sword.
Ganondorf is the reincarnation of Demise. Demise, in his imprisoned form, has the seal embedded in its forehead. When you finally battle Demise in his true form, he has a scar in his forehead from the seal being driven in previously by Link. What does Ganondorf have on his forehead? Some kind of jewel. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that the jewel on Ganondorf's forehead somehow contains, controls, or maintains Demise's power within him. It might, but I do think there is a connection or relevance to the scar on Demise and the jewel on Ganondorf. With that, let's go back to the end of the Wind Waker. Link stabs Ganondorf in the forehead, shattering the jewel as a result. Now, what has the Master Sword itself acted as in the past, besides just the Blade of Evil's Bane? A type of seal or key which holds back Demise/Ganondorf and their powers. So at the end of Wind Waker, Ganondorf's jewel is shattered with the Master Sword in its place, and Ganondorf is then turned to stone. I think that at some point between Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild, something happened to the Master Sword. It was removed from Ganondorf's skull. Either someone intentionally or unintentionally moved it, or the rock that is now Ganondorf simply crumbled. I mean, it's clearly rusted and damaged, possibly due to salt water, and in a pedestal at least from what we've seen so far. Getting to the point though, I believe the reason Calamity Ganon is this gaseous form is because it no longer has a body to inhabit. The spirit of Demise/Ganon was released by the removal of the only seal holding it back. Calamity Ganon is actually in search of a new body. The spirit or soul of Demise/Ganon wasn't killed and reincarnated as it should have been, but trapped within this shell of its former self. Being released, it's now this mindless and angry essence causing destruction where it can. I think this would actually help explain why the Guardians and the Flying Fortress turn red at times. It could be that Ganon is trying to possess a new body since it, no longer has one.
Now, if it is the case that Breath of the Wild takes place at the end of the Wind Waker timeline, I think this is Aonuma's way of forcing a game to take the place of what I feel is rightfully Zelda 1 and 2's place on the Wind Waker side. But not all is lost though, as Zelda 1 and 2 could still fit if it were to be revised in the manner I'm suggesting. Actually, I think it's almost imperative that these three games lead to one another so long as they're all at the end of the Wind Waker timeline. Now, I am aware that there are folks who think Breath of the Wild takes place after Zelda 1 and 2, but on the Heroes Defeated timeline. But hopefully I've convinced you enough this far that the timeline at least should be revised concerning the Heroes Defeated timeline and how Zelda 1 and 2 should be moved over to the Wind Waker side. So stay with me here as we further look over this direction of Breath of the Wild's placement.
The next bit of this theory, though, about Calamity Ganon looks at the state of Hyrule. If you've noticed, the castle that Calamity Ganon is circling around happens to be on the side of Old Hyrule, not past Death Mountain where I think New Hyrule is. With that in mind, I think it would be an interesting direction for the story to say that, at some point after New Hyrule had been founded, the New Kingdom attempted to expand back to Old Hyrule. Maybe they settled there for a little while, got their castle built, a new city market, the Sheikah resurfaced, but after a while, Calamity Ganon emerged from his stone tomb. This wave of settlers disrupted the seal held by the Master Sword, allowing the spirit of Ganon to once again rampage across the land he once hoped to conquer in the past. Link is put to sleep somehow, for whatever reason, 100 years pass and Link reawakens. And we're assuming he and Zelda defeat Calamity Ganon at the end of Breath of the Wild.
Now, how can Zelda 1 and 2 possibly follow after this? Good question. I don't have a simple answer for you though, so the explanation I can see is unless Link and Zelda in Breath of the Wild just completely obliterate Ganon to the point where he can no longer be reincarnated or anything, I think it's possible, improbable but not impossible, that during the events of Breath of the Wild we actually see Calamity Ganon possess a new body in the form of Pig Ganon from Zelda 1.
Maybe the game ends with him being defeated by Link and Zelda, but not killed. Perhaps Ganon is sealed away again, but only to escape for Zelda 1. Something else that would have to happen though is, he somehow gets a hold of the Triforce of Power again, eventually leading to Zelda 1, where Link from that game kills him and turns him into a pile of ash. The only other reason I can see this is because there are at least some remnants of the Ancient Kingdom, with the Temple of Time still standing, for example, in Breath of the Wild. But over time, things break down, become overtaken by nature, removing any hints of what was a great civilization. Which can still explain why there are only so many dungeons as the only structures in Zelda 1, because by that point, the majority of these old structures have finally disappeared, including the Temple of Time. Also kind of conveniently explains why there's a cemetery in Zelda 1, a burial site to those who fought and died against Calamity Ganon to take back Old Hyrule. So maybe we'll see a cemetery of some significance in Breath of the Wild.
I know, very loosey-goosey explanations, but that is one theory. Plus, I'll be honest with you, I am just really kind of attached and love the idea of Ganon's soul breaking free from the stone casing that happened in Wind Waker, and he's just trying to inhabit a new body. I'll also admit that everything I've suggested would be a rather convoluted and messy story that would have to happen in order for Zelda 1 to come after Breath of the Wild. But, I mean, it's not the first time Nintendo made some convoluted and messy choices for Zelda lore. I mean, the Zora, fish people, evolved into bird people because they couldn't adapt to sea life in Wind Waker? Right now there are just too many questions and not enough answers on where this game's placed. I have considered the theory that Breath of the Wild is after Zelda 1 and 2, but placing it before still makes the most sense to me right now. I am open to the discussion of other possibilities, but for now, I'm just going to run with Breath of the Wild being at the end of Wind Waker, with the revision to the timeline that Zelda 1 and 2 follow after. Hey, thanks for watching part 3 of 4 of our look at the Zelda timeline as we considered one possible location for Breath of the Wild on the timeline. Don't forget to watch the final episode here on Geekery Collective, and if you enjoyed this video, here are some others you might enjoy as well. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe.